The day Brenda Vance tried to have me arrested on my own land was the day she learned I wasn't just a resident. I was the foundation her entire world was built on. She stood there, smug and triumphant, as two county sheriff cruisers kicked up gravel on the road my grandfather built, their red and blue lights defiling the quiet morning air. She thought she was calling the law on a stubborn old man in a cabin. She had no idea she was declaring war on the man who legally owns the roads she drives on, the land her house is built on, and the water mains that feed her pristine, oversized mansion. She saw a retired relic in a flannel shirt. She failed to see a man who spent 30 years with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers designing the very infrastructure needed to withstand an enemy attack. Brenda Vance, in her infinite arrogance, was about to learn that while my patience was retired, my skills were not. She had just picked a fight with the one man in the entire state who could dismantle her entire community with a series of phone calls and a few registered letters, and she had done it with a smile on her face. Brenda Vance, 55 years old, and the self-appointed queen of the Aspen Creek Estates, HOA, was a creature of pure, undiluted entitlement. Dressed in $500 yoga pants and driving a pearl-white Range Rover, her entire existence was a desperate performance of new money trying to look old. She stood beside the deputy's car, pointing a manicured finger at my home, her voice a shrill instrument of condescension. To her, my family's cabin, built from timber milled on this very property, was not a legacy. It was that eyesore. It was a threat to our property values. The official complaints, the ones she'd filed that morning, were masterpieces of malicious fiction. Failure to comply with aesthetic codes, unpermitted debris pile, which was my neatly stacked winter firewood, and my personal favorite, harboring an inoperable commercial vehicle, a charge leveled against the vintage 1968 Ford truck I'd spent the last 3 years personally restoring to mint condition. This wasn't about the rules. This was a war for the soul of this valley. It was her vision of a sterile, beige, high-priced suburb against my family's century-old legacy of rugged, authentic independence. She saw a man living a quiet life and mistook it for weakness. 30 years I served with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I wasn't some paper pusher in a cubicle. I was a colonel who mastered the bedrock of civilization, geology, hydrology, infrastructure, and the web of federal laws that govern them all. I designed dams that held back entire rivers, surveyed critical terrain for forward operating bases that functioned like small cities, and wrote the master plans that are still in use today. I understand land not as a pretty picture on a real estate brochure, but as a complex system of rights, easements, titles, and legal obligations that run deeper than any foundation she could ever pour. She thought she was weaponizing the county against me. She was too ignorant to realize I had helped write the very federal codes she was about to violate. She thought she was an authority because a handful of suburbanites voted her HOA president. I was an authority because the United States government had trusted me to build and secure its most critical infrastructure. She thought that police citation, the flimsy piece of paper the embarrassed young deputy handed me, was the final nail in my coffin. She was wrong. It was the first nail in hers. By the time I was finished, she would be stripped of her title, her power, and her manufactured pride, all of it crushed under the weight of legal documents she was too arrogant to ever read. The war wasn't just coming for her. It was already over, and she was the only one who didn't know it yet. What's the most ridiculous HOA violation you've ever heard of? Tell me in the comments below. I want to know just how deep this insanity goes. Because what started with a bogus complaint about my woodpile was about to end with federal agents at Brenda's door, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. I watched from my porch as the sheriff's cruisers retreated down the gravel road, their dust trail hanging in the air like a fading insult. Brenda Vance shot me a look of pure, triumphant hatred before climbing into her Range Rover, a silent promise that this was only the beginning. I let her have her moment. An enemy's overconfidence is a commander's greatest asset. I walked back inside my cabin, the flimsy citation feeling ridiculous in my hand. On the wall hung a framed survey map from 1956, its paper yellowed with age, the lines drawn with a draftsman's perfect precision. My grandfather's signature was in the bottom right corner. This valley wasn't just my inheritance. It was the result of a promise made in sweat and sealed in law by the men who came before me. They didn't just find this land. They tamed it, they shaped it, and most importantly, they protected it. Brenda Vance had picked a fight not just with a retired colonel, but with 3 generations of Rourke ingenuity and the full, crushing weight of the law they had put in place to protect their legacy. My family didn't just buy a plot of land here, they created a future. My grandfather, a civil engineer who saw the West as a canvas, and my father, a surveyor who could read the topography of the land like a book, were the first to plat this valley. They carved the roads, plotted the wells, and laid the foundations for a community. But they had seen what unchecked greed did to other beautiful places. They had seen communities devour themselves from the inside out, cannibalized by petty tyrants and short-sighted developers. So in 1958, they did something brilliant. Before selling a single lot, they established the Aspen Creek Valley Trust. It was an ironclad legal fortress designed for one purpose: stewardship. The trust was established in perpetuity to own and maintain all common and critical infrastructure. The roads, the main water lines, the 50 acres of pristine woodland at the heart of the valley, and, most importantly, all utility and access easements, the legal veins and arteries of the entire community, were deeded to the trust forever. My father was the first trustee. Now I was the only one. The homeowners in the Aspen Creek Estates lived under a profound delusion, and Brenda Vance was their high priestess. They believed their HOA was the ultimate authority. They paid their dues, they obeyed the bylaws, and they feared the violation notices. What none of them, including Brenda, had ever bothered to read was the master deed for the entire valley. Buried in the dense legalese of that founding document was the unalterable truth of their existence. The HOA was nothing more than a beautification subcommittee. It was a third-party contractor, established by the trust with a severely limited mandate. They were legally empowered to manage trash collection, maintain the flower beds at the front gate, and mediate disputes over fence heights. That was it. They had no authority over infrastructure, no right to restrict access, and absolutely no legal standing to challenge the trust itself. For 20 years, they'd been a glorified garden club playing make-believe government, and I had let them, because their petty squabbles were harmless. Until now. Now, their little tyrant had mistaken her gavel for a scepter, and it was time to remind her who actually owned the throne. My life's work had been a continuation of my family's legacy, just on a global scale. 30 years in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wasn't a job. It was an education in the fundamental realities of power and control. While Brenda Vance was learning how to host cocktail parties, I was learning how to divert rivers. While she was mastering the art of the passive-aggressive email, I was designing infrastructure for forward operating bases in the most hostile environments on Earth. I didn't just oversee projects. I was in the dirt, analyzing geological surveys, studying water rights that crossed international borders, and navigating the labyrinth of federal and military law that holds it all together. I wasn't just building bases. I was learning, with surgical precision, how to analyze and dismantle enemy operations piece by piece. Retiring back to the cabin wasn't an end to my service. It was a return to my first and most important post, the stewardship of this valley. Brenda Vance, with her pathetic little police stunt, had just designated herself an enemy combatant. She had no idea she was launching an attack against a fortified position, and that the man inside had the original blueprints. Later that afternoon, I saw Gus's old pickup truck rumbling up the drive. Gus was 75, with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that had seen this valley through every season of its life. His family had ranched the next parcel over since before my grandfather arrived. He'd seen the police cars. He got out, shaking his head. "Don't you let that woman get to you, John," he growled, skipping any pleasantries. "She's all hat and no cattle, always has been. Thinks 'cause she scared some fella into painting his house beige that she's some kind of queen." He looked from me to the pristine mansion visible on the opposite ridge. "She and the rest of 'em have forgotten the old rules. They forgot who laid the first stone of that road they drive on." He gave me a knowing look, a glimmer of the old fighting spirit in his eyes. "That woman thinks she runs this place because she can fine you for the color of your mailbox. She has no idea you can legally terminate the water supply to her $500,000 English garden, and there's not a damn thing her army of lawyers could do about it." Gus was right. I held all the power. I could have ended this before it began with a single devastating legal filing, but a good commander never attacks without perfect intelligence. An emotional response is a tactical error. A measured, systematic annihilation based on overwhelming evidence is a work of art. Brenda Vance had declared war based on her feelings. I was going to destroy her with facts. It was time to see just how many laws she had broken in her arrogant little reign. And I had a feeling she'd been very, very busy. To understand a predator, you must first observe it in its natural habitat. For Brenda Vance, that habitat was the monthly HOA meeting in the sterile beige community center. I attended the next one, not as a resident, but as a military strategist conducting reconnaissance. I sat in the back, silent, watching the theater of her petty tyranny. She ran the meeting like a drill sergeant in a banana republic, wielding her gavel like a weapon to crush any hint of dissent. The residents sat cowed and silent. They had been conditioned. They knew that asking a question about the budget could result in a surprise inspection of their lawn the next day. Brenda stood at the podium, basking in the fluorescent lights, her voice a finely tuned instrument of condescension as she read through a list of new regulations, rules about acceptable wind chime tones, the mandatory seasonal rotation of decorative flags, the precise shade of white required for all window trim. It was a masterclass in psychological control, designed to grind down the residents' will to resist, to make them feel like tenants in the homes they owned. I watched her, not with anger, but with a cold, professional assessment. I saw the deep insecurity behind the performance, the desperate need for control that drove her. And I saw the fatal flaw in her strategy. She believed her own propaganda. She actually thought this little room was her kingdom. Her corruption was as blatant as it was amateurish. I reviewed the budget she'd distributed, and the numbers told a story of brazen theft hiding in plain sight. A line item for $20,000 in common area landscape enhancements was a direct funnel to her brother's overpriced landscaping company. A recurring $5,000 monthly legal consulting fee was, in reality, a retainer for the lawyer she used for her personal vendettas against residents. She had the HOA paying for the very weapons she used to terrorize them. She spoke openly about her influence with County Councilman Davies, a man whose campaign signs had miraculously appeared on every common area lawn the previous fall. "I had a very productive chat with Councilman Davies," she'd announce smugly. "He assures me the county will be fast-tracking all nuisance complaints from our community." It wasn't a report. It was a threat. She was telling everyone that her power extended beyond the neighborhood, that she had allies in the government who would back her play. She was building a fiefdom, paid for by the very people she was oppressing. The real cost of her reign was written on the faces of people like Mr. Garcia. He sat 3 rows ahead of me, a good man who now looked perpetually exhausted. The Garcias were Brenda's masterpiece, her monument to cruelty. 2 years ago, they had installed a playset for their daughters in their backyard. The wood was cedar, but Brenda, citing a bylaw she invented on the spot, declared it had to be pine. That was the opening shot. From there, the war was relentless. Daily fines of $100, violation notices for the grass being a 1/4 inch too high around the playset's legs, an anonymous complaint to Child Protective Services about the playset's unsafe construction. Brenda put a lien on their house for the unpaid fines, bled them dry with legal fees, and harassed them with such vicious, personal intensity that they finally broke. They sold their dream home at a loss just to escape her. Mr. Garcia was now a ghost at these meetings, a walking warning to anyone else who dared to defy the Queen. Seeing him there, a man hollowed out by this petty tyrant, crystallized my objective. This wasn't about my cabin anymore. This was about liberating an occupied territory. My turn in the crosshairs began the Monday after the meeting. The harassment was no longer random. It was systematic. A certified letter arrived from the HOA's law firm, informing me of a $1,000 fine for the unapproved and hazardous woodpile, citing bylaw 14.7c, a clause that pertained to swimming pool maintenance. It was sloppy, but the legal letterhead was designed to intimidate. 3 days later, another notice was stuck to the windshield of my Ford. The violation for an inoperable commercial vehicle now included a threat. If the vehicle was not removed in 48 hours, it would be towed at my expense. It was a classic escalation, testing my response. Then came the official letter from the County Air Quality Board, stating a formal complaint had been filed regarding excessive particulate emissions from my chimney. It was her, weaponizing another level of government, trying to bury me in bureaucracy. The final move of the week was the most direct. Her brother's landscaping crew, a pack of sullen teenagers in matching neon green shirts, spent an entire afternoon taking soil samples right at my property line, a pathetic show of force designed to tell me that she could, and would, invade my space whenever she pleased. She thought she was drowning me in paper, surrounding me, cutting off my avenues of escape. What she was really doing was handing me a signed confession, over and over again. Every false complaint filed with a government agency, every dollar of HOA money misallocated to her pet lawyers, every threatening letter sent on her authority was another piece of evidence. It was another nail for the coffin I was building for her. I had seen her tactics. I had witnessed the human cost of her cruelty. I had all the anecdotal evidence I needed. Now, it was time to get the official records, to pull the deeds, the financials, and the federal statutes she was too ignorant to know existed. It was time to build the weapon that would bring her entire corrupt empire crashing down into dust. Brenda's paper assault was an act of tactical stupidity. A real commander doesn't waste ammunition on random targets. He uses enemy fire to triangulate their position. Every baseless complaint, every fraudulent fine, was a signal flare that illuminated her tactics and her weaknesses. My response was not to engage in her chaotic skirmish. My response was to go to the armory. In my study, behind a portrait of my grandfather, is a 4-ton fire-rated security safe. Inside isn't cash or gold, but something far more valuable: a complete legal history of the Aspen Creek Valley. This was not a phase of research. It was a phase of laying out the weapons for the coming execution. I placed the foundational documents on my oak desk, the very desk upon which my father and grandfather had designed this community. the air filled with the scent of old paper and curing ink, the smell of unbreakable contracts. Brenda was fighting with flimsy, photocopied bylaws from 2018. I was preparing to go to war with the Valley's Constitution. The centerpiece was the original 1958 Deed of Trust. It's a magnificent document, bound in blue linen, the text printed on heavy, watermarked paper. It is a legal fortress. I ran my hand over the raised seal, my fingers tracing the same indentation my father's had 60 years ago. I didn't need to read the whole thing. I had it memorized. I turned directly to Article 4, Section 3, the powers and limitations of the Aesthetics Subcommittee. There it was, in the precise, unambiguous language of my grandfather, the engineer. The HOA was granted a limited mandate to oversee surface-level community beautification and refuse management. The document explicitly stated that the trust retained sole and absolute authority over all infrastructure, including but not limited to roadways, water mains, common lands, and all access and utility easements. Brenda wasn't just overstepping her bounds. She was operating in a legal fantasy. She and her entire board were in direct, material breach of the very document that allowed their committee to exist in the first place. Next came the parcel maps and the easement covenants. Decades ago, my father had the foresight to ensure the trust owned a 10-foot-wide utility easement across the edge of every single property. It was a legal necessity, ensuring access for repairs to water and power lines. For years, it was just lines on a map. I decided it was time to make it real. I hired a professional survey crew, the best in the state. They used modern GPS and ground-penetrating radar to mark the exact boundaries of the trust's property. A week later, I had a brand-new, digitally rendered map of the entire valley. The visual was devastating. The trust's easements didn't just clip the edge of people's yards. They ran directly under Brenda Vance's new 6-figure flagstone patio. They bisected her prize-winning English rose garden. According to the covenants, I had the legal right to bring in a backhoe and trench right through the middle of her manicured paradise at any time, for any reason related to infrastructure maintenance. It was a surgical tool of immense power, and she had no idea it was pointed directly at her. But the true bombshell, the weapon that would elevate this from a civil dispute to a federal matter, was filed away with the original infrastructure grants. I pulled out a file labeled FHWA-1962. In exchange for $250,000 in federal funds to build the main 2-lane road into the valley, Aspen Creek Drive, my grandfather had signed a binding agreement with the Federal Highway Administration. The terms were crystal clear. The road was designated a public thoroughfare and must remain accessible to public traffic in perpetuity. Brenda's grand new gates, the ones with the pretentious Aspen Creek Estates, private community gold leaf lettering, were not just an HOA vanity project. They were a direct and criminal violation of a 60-year-old federal contract. Her attempt to create an exclusive, private enclave was, in fact, fraud against the U.S. government. She wasn't just a bully, she was a federal criminal. With the legal framework established, it was time to document her specific crimes. I brought in an old colleague, Miller, a man who'd spent 25 years as a senior agent in the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. Miller didn't just find needles in haystacks. He could tell you the make, model, and serial number of the needle, and who put it there. 2 weeks later, his report landed on my desk. It was a thing of beauty, a clinical and emotionless catalog of Brenda's downfall. He had traced the money. The $50,000 from the HOA's road maintenance fund that had paid for the illegal gates had been funneled through her brother's landscaping company, which had then kicked back $10,000 to a personal account in Brenda's name. It was classic embezzlement, and wire fraud. He found the campaign donations, a series of 5 $2,000 checks, made from her brother's business to Councilman Davies, dated the same week Davies began fast-tracking Brenda's nuisance complaints at the county level. That was conspiracy. Miller's forensic accountants had even dissected the HOA's legal bills and found that Brenda had used their retainer to pay for a lawsuit related to a private business deal of her own. The evidence was absolute, documented with bank statements, emails, and sworn affidavits from a disgruntled former employee of her brother's. The file on my desk was no longer just a collection of evidence. It was a targeting package, complete with financial, civil, and criminal trajectories. The master deed was the legal justification for the attack. The federal grant violation was the air support. Miller's intelligence report was the ground assault plan. Brenda Vance, in her insulated world of petty tyranny, had spent the last month laying landmines for me. She had no idea that I was about to drop a bunker-busting bomb directly on her head, and that I had the precise coordinates for every corner of her corrupt little life. The reconnaissance phase was over. The assault was about to begin. An enemy backed into a corner becomes predictable. Their tactics devolve from strategy to raw, undisciplined aggression. Brenda Vance, frustrated by my complete silence in the face of her paper assault, made the classic mistake of escalating her attack on all fronts simultaneously. She believed my lack of response was fear. In reality, it was contempt. I was simply letting her commit all of her crimes on the record before I made my move. Her first major gambit involved her political puppet, Councilman Davies. A county inspector, a pompous man with a clipboard and an air of rehearsed authority, arrived at my property with a notice to condemn my woodshed. The charge was that it was an unstable and unpermitted structure. I didn't even bother going to the door. I had already briefed my lawyer, a sharp, methodical man named David Chen, who specialized in crushing municipal overreach. Chen met the inspector in my driveway. He didn't argue. He didn't debate codes. He simply handed the inspector a 2-page document. The first page was a copy of the clause from the master deed establishing the trust's sole authority over all structures on its designated lands. The second was a formal notice of intent to file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the county for trespass and harassment, naming both Councilman Davies and the inspector personally. The inspector read the papers, his face draining of all color. He looked at the cabin, then back at the legal document, and seemed to grasp for the first time that he had been sent into a minefield. Without another word, he got in his car and left. The condemnation notice blew across my lawn, another piece of worthless paper. Her next attack was more direct. She tried to cut my utilities. I received a formal notification from the Regional Power and Water Company stating that, at the request of the Aspen Creek Estates HOA, my services were scheduled for termination due to ongoing community bylaw violations. This was a bold move, an attempt to make my cabin uninhabitable. I called the utilities' corporate legal department directly. I didn't identify myself as a resident. I identified myself as Colonel John Rourke, trustee of the Aspen Creek Valley Trust. I calmly explained to their chief counsel that their company operated its lines through the valley based on a 50-year access lease granted by the trust. I pointed him to Section 9, Paragraph 4 of that lease, which stipulated that any interruption of service to the trustee's personal residence constituted a material breach of the entire multi-billion-dollar contract. I told him that if a single light flickered in my cabin, I would terminate their lease by noon the next day, and they could begin the process of removing all of their equipment from my valley. There was a long, profound silence on the other end of the line. 2 hours later, I received a personal call from the utilities CEO, apologizing for the clerical error and assuring me that my service would never, under any circumstances, be interrupted again. He also mentioned, with considerable interest, that they would be re-evaluating their company's relationship with the HOA. The community was a hive of nervous energy. My quiet defiance was having an effect. Some residents, terrified of Brenda, avoided my gaze at the general store. But others, the ones who had been here longer, started to give me quiet nods of support. Gus was making his rounds, telling the old-timers that a reckoning was coming. The rumors reached a local independent journalist, a young woman who ran a surprisingly popular blog called The Valley Sentinel. She started asking questions about the HOA's finances and their sudden, aggressive legal posture. The narrative was beginning to slip from Brenda's control. My lawyer then launched the warning shot I'd authorized. He sent a simple cease and desist letter to the HOA board. It was a masterpiece of understated menace. It didn't lay out our entire arsenal, but it formally demanded they retract the fines and stop all harassment, citing their actions as being in direct violation of the founding covenants and established authority of the Aspen Creek Valley Trust. According to Miller's source on the board, the reaction was exactly what I'd predicted. Brenda, in her pathological arrogance, laughed it off. She held the letter up at a board meeting and called it the desperate ramblings of a senile old man. She ordered their lawyer to draft a response that would bury him. But the lawyer, a slick, corporate type from a downtown firm, wasn't laughing. The mention of a trust with founding authority had clearly sent a chill down his spine. He was seen frantically typing on his tablet, his face growing paler by the second. He weakly advised Brenda to de-escalate until we can clarify the legal landscape, but she was too high on her own power to listen. Convinced I was bluffing, she made her final, fatal error. She called an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was simple: to authorize a $100,000 special assessment on all residents to fund a massive lawsuit against me, a suit designed to have me declared a public nuisance and empower the HOA to foreclose on my property to collect the fraudulent fines. She wasn't just walking into my trap. She was sprinting into it with a blindfold on. The community center was packed. Brenda had made attendance mandatory, and the air was thick with a mixture of fear, resentment, and morbid curiosity. The local blogger was in the back, her phone discreetly recording. Brenda was in her element, standing at the podium, a dictator addressing her captive audience. She delivered a 20-minute tirade, painting me as a dangerous recluse, a threat to their safety and their property values. She presented the lawsuit as a holy crusade to purify their community. When she finished, she looked out at the silent crowd, her eyes gleaming. All in favor of the special assessment to fund legal action against Mr. Rourke, she demanded, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. Before a single hand could go up, I stood. I had been sitting silently in the back row, and my movement drew every eye in the room. I didn't rush. I walked calmly down the central aisle, my footsteps echoing in the sudden, tomb-like silence. I stopped directly in front of the podium and looked up at her, my expression unreadable. "Brenda," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "There appears to be a procedural misunderstanding." Her face flushed with rage. "You are out of order. You are not recognized." "You're right," I said. "I'm not recognized. I'm the authority." I let that hang in the air for a second. "You seem to believe this homeowners association is a governing body. It is not. According to the master deed of the Aspen Creek Valley Trust, which owns all common land in this valley, including the very ground this building is sitting on, this organization is designated as a beautification subcommittee." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Brenda's face had gone from red to a waxy, unnatural white. And as the sole legally appointed trustee of that founding authority, I continued, my voice as cold and hard as iron. I am informing you that your committee's contract to manage surface-level aesthetics is hereby terminated, effective immediately, for gross negligence, financial malfeasance, and multiple material breaches of contract. I looked out at the stunned faces of the residents, then back at Brenda's, which was now a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. This meeting, I declared, is over. Please vacate the premises. The silence was shattered by Brenda's scream. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure, undiluted fury. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, her carefully constructed composure disintegrating in an instant. "I'll destroy you. I'll sue you into the Stone Age." I looked at her, my face devoid of all emotion. Her threats were the pathetic flailing of a deposed tyrant. I let her finish her tirade, and in the ringing silence that followed, I delivered the final devastating blow. "Please do," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a surgeon's scalpel. "My lawyers are very much looking forward to the discovery process, and I suspect the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is currently investigating your violation of a binding federal highway grant, will be watching with great interest as well." The moment I mentioned the U.S. Attorney's Office, the fight was over. All that remained was the systematic dismantling of the enemy's command structure. An effective military operation is not about chaos. It is about the precise and overwhelming application of force on critical vulnerabilities. Brenda's empire was built on 3 pillars: her fraudulent authority, her corrupt finances, and her political influence. At 0800 hours the following morning, I gave my lawyer the order to execute strikes on all 3 targets simultaneously. What followed was not a lawsuit. It was a coordinated, multi-front annihilation that moved with the speed and finality of a lightning strike. Brenda Vance had spent months waging a war of attrition. I ended it in 72 hours. The first strike was federal. My lawyer, Chen, didn't just file a complaint with the Federal Highway Administration. He delivered a comprehensive targeting package directly to the Inspector General's office in Washington, D.C. The package included the original, signed 1962 grant agreement, USGS maps of the public right-of-way, Miller's high-resolution photographs of the illegal gates, and a sworn affidavit from me detailing the HOA's refusal to remove them. The FHWA doesn't send warning letters. When faced with evidence of criminal fraud involving federal funds, they launch full-scale investigations. Within 48 hours, the regional FHWA office had notified the county of a formal inquiry, putting Councilman Davies directly in the path of a federal steamroller. The threat wasn't just fines. It was the potential for the county to have to pay back decades of federal highway funds. Davies, who had been Brenda's loyal pawn, was now facing a career-ending federal investigation because of a set of pretentious gold-leaf gates. He cut all contact with her immediately, leaving her first flank completely exposed. The second strike was financial, and it was the kill shot. We didn't file a simple lawsuit for damages. We filed a civil RICO suit, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Corrupt Organizations Act is the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon, designed to dismantle criminal enterprises. Our lawsuit named Brenda Vance, her brother's Shell Landscaping Company, and Councilman Davies as co-conspirators in a criminal enterprise engaged in a pattern of racketeering, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement. The evidence, meticulously compiled by Miller, was attached as a 1,000-page exhibit. But the most brutal part of a RICO action is the ability to petition the court for a prejudgment asset freeze. Chen argued successfully that Brenda and her co-conspirators were a flight risk and were likely to hide or destroy assets. The judge agreed. At 11:30 a.m. on Tuesday, Brenda Vance went to use her corporate credit card to pay her lawyer, and it was declined. She tried to transfer money between her accounts and found they were frozen solid. Her stocks, her real estate holdings, her personal and business accounts. Everything was locked down by federal court order. She was financially paralyzed, unable to even hire a lawyer to defend herself. We had cut off her supply lines completely. The third strike was criminal. While the civil suit froze her assets, the package Miller and Chen had prepared was couriered directly to the head of the Public Integrity Unit at the State Attorney General's office. It wasn't a tip or a complaint. It was a professionally prepared, ready-to-prosecute case. It contained the complete forensic accounting of the HOA's books, the paper trail of the kickbacks, the sworn statements from witnesses, and a legal brief outlining the specific state laws that had been violated. We didn't ask them to investigate. We showed them where the bodies were buried. 2 days later, the Attorney General's office announced a formal criminal investigation into the financial mismanagement and potential public corruption connected to the Aspen Creek Estates HOA and its ties to the county council. Brenda was no longer just a defendant in a lawsuit. She was now the primary target of a state criminal probe. With her authority shattered and her finances crippled, all that was left was to dismantle her machine. At my direction, the Aspen Creek Valley Trust issued formal notices of contract termination to every vendor the HOA employed. The management company, the security firm, her brother's landscaping business, all of them were legally notified that their contracts were null and void, as they had been operating under the authority of a defunct subcommittee with no legal standing. The management company, seeing the impending legal firestorm, immediately dropped the HOA as a client. Her brother's company, now named in a RICO suit, had its own assets frozen. The security guards who used to patrol the neighborhood simply vanished overnight. In the span of a single business day, the Aspen Creek Estates Homeowners Association had ceased to exist as a functioning entity. It was nothing more than a name on a lawsuit, a ghost of an organization with no money, no staff, and no power. The public fallout was swift and merciless. The Valley Sentinel blog published a devastating expose, complete with leaked copies of the RICO filing and the AG's press release. The regional news station sent a van, and the lead story on the 6 o'clock news was the unfolding corruption scandal, featuring a long lens shot of a process server handing a weeping Brenda Vance another legal summons on the driveway of her $500,000 home. Her lawyer, the slick corporate type, who had underestimated the old man in the cabin, formally resigned from her case, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest and filing a lien against her frozen assets for his unpaid bills. She was alone, toxic, and utterly ruined. The war was won. Her paper empire had been turned to ash in less than 3 days. But victory isn't complete until the enemy's flag is captured and the territory is secured. All that was left was the final public surrender and the restoration of a community she had tried so hard to poison. A war is not truly over until peace is secured and the enemy's capacity to fight is permanently neutralized. With Brenda's assets frozen and her reputation vaporized, the legal system executed the final maneuvers with bureaucratic efficiency. Faced with an ironclad federal RICO case that carried a sentence of 20 years, and with the state attorney general preparing a separate slate of criminal charges, Brenda Vance broke completely. She took the plea deal. It was a complete and unconditional surrender. She pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of embezzlement. In exchange for a reduced sentence, she agreed to testify against Councilman Davies and forfeit all assets connected to her fraudulent activities. The corrupt homeowners association she had built in her image was formally dissolved by a court order, its charter revoked, its very existence wiped from the public record as if it had never been. The law she had tried to use as a weapon had, in the end, been turned against her, and its judgment was absolute. Her public humiliation was a quiet, pathetic affair, far more satisfying than any loud confrontation. I watched from my cabin porch one Saturday morning as the asset liquidation company descended on her mansion. It wasn't a moving van, it was a vulture picking a carcass clean. Her overpriced designer furniture, the gaudy art she'd bragged about, the pristine Range Rover, all of it was inventoried, tagged, and hauled away to be sold at a public auction. The proceeds were used to pay the restitution ordered by the court, with the largest portion going to the Garcia family and the other victims of her reign, who had joined our class action suit. The final sight was the most telling. Weeks later, a beat-up U-Haul pulled up to the now empty house. It was Brenda, her face pale and haggard, her designer clothes replaced by cheap sweats. She loaded a few cardboard boxes of personal belongings into the back, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own ambition. As she drove away for the last time, she didn't even glance in my direction. I was no longer a person to her. I was the architect of her ruin, a force she still couldn't comprehend. She hadn't been defeated by a person. She had been broken by a legacy. With the tyrant gone, it was time to rebuild the community she had fractured. I called a meeting at the community center. It wasn't an HOA meeting, it was a gathering of neighbors. I stood before them, not as a ruler, but as the steward my grandfather had intended me to be. I laid out the history of the Aspen Creek Valley Trust, explaining its purpose was not to dictate, but to protect. I proposed a new way forward, the formal dissolution of the old, corrupt HOA model to be replaced by a simple, transparent residence committee. It would be an elected, volunteer body with a single purpose: to advise the trust on community matters and organize social events. They would have no power to fine, no power to place liens, and no power to terrorize their neighbors. The power to punish had been abolished. All that was left was the power to cooperate. The relief in the room was palpable. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in years, the residents of the valley were not subjects, but partners. The first official act of the trust under this new structure was to right a symbolic wrong. Using the funds forfeited by Brenda's criminal enterprise, we hired a local company to tear down the illegal, pretentious gates at the valley's entrance. In their place, we commissioned a beautiful, handcrafted wooden sign that simply read, "Aspen Creek Valley, established, 1958. With the remaining funds, we began work on a new community playground and picnic area on the 50 acres of common woodland the trust protected. At the dedication ceremony, attended by nearly every family in the valley, we unveiled the name, carved into an archway made from local timber, Garcia Park. Mr. Garcia, standing with his wife and daughters, wept. It was more than just a playground. It was a monument to their resilience, and a permanent reminder that this community would never again allow a bully to poison its soul. The atmosphere in the valley transformed. The oppressive tension was gone, replaced by the sounds of children's laughter and neighbors talking over fences once more. Standing on my porch, watching the sunset paint the ridges in hues of orange and purple, I finally understood the full weight of my grandfather's foresight. He hadn't just left me land. He had left me a duty, a responsibility I had nearly ignored. Defeating Brenda Vance wasn't the victory. The victory was the restoration of his vision, a community of individuals, free to live their lives without the boot of a petty tyrant on their necks. My legacy, my family's legacy, was now secure. But Brenda's testimony against Councilman Davies had cracked open a much larger conspiracy, a network of corrupt developers and bought politicians that spread far beyond our quiet valley. They thought the fight was over. They didn't know that the man in the cabin, the trustee of the Aspen Creek Valley Trust, had just found his new mission. Brenda Vance was a symptom. Now it was time to go after the disease.